Okay, I don't have to lack confidence because I have the confidence monitor. In the words of Monty Python, now for something completely different. This is not an automation talk. I come not to bury automation, but to expand upon it. And that's the theme here for Total Network Operations. I feel like a vendor, and I'm giving you a roadmap, at least for this talk. Kind of set expectations, and here are the things that I want to make sure come clear in the conversation. We'll talk about what the heck is this TNOps thing, talking about how it's more than automation, and then how can we manage and leverage disruption to improve network operations. So what is Total Network Operations? Well, in short form, it's a project with a podcast. It's on Packet Pushers. After pestering Ethan for a long time, we got to go, and that part of it is a blast. Like learning from people and giving them an opportunity to talk about what they're doing from an operations perspective has just been great. So Ethan and team, thank you for that. It's an opportunity to get other people's great ideas out there. What I want to do with all this is really elevate NetOps, put focus on it, bring more attention to it so we can collectively make it better. Some of the big operational ideas that I bury in there are viewing everything as a holistic system. You know, everything's connected in your NetOps stack. Automation is a really important piece of it, but it's bigger than that. Explore adjacencies between those technologies that you're using strictly for operations. Put an emphasis on continuous learning and making explicit opportunities to figure out what's going on in the market. And then figuring out how to adapt DevOps to NetOps. The main premise that I operate from here is that NetOps is basically an underserved community. It's kind of the lowest rung on the ladder. Who's been in a network operations job or still is? Right, you always got funding for everything you asked for. The vendors always go to you to see what's needed in the network. No, it's often considered entry level, lowest rung on the ladder, but it's the group of people that keep the network up and running. They're the operators, and if you're familiar with military terminology, I think there's something to that. You know, network operators are the operators making sure network infrastructure continues to work. It doesn't get the constructive attention that it needs, and there's a CapEx versus OpEx thing here where it's so much easier to identify the POs for gear and focus on the CapEx, but not get a focus on the OpEx of everything that goes into operating a network. The best anecdotal numbers I have there, basically 10x to 1 spent on OpEx versus CapEx for networks. I've floated this number in probably a dozen different forums. I do not have a scientific basis for it, but it's pretty good anecdotal proportions. You know, we put a lot of focus on the big POs that we know about, but we lose what's frittered away in terms of operations cost. I firmly believe we can change this. Maybe start a little bit of a movement. You might say we could call it a revolution to help NetOps participate in its own rescue. I know that's dramatic, but now it's on video. I've been through a little bit of an evolution with this. I started thinking about this last year and was really motivated by the John Willis keynote at AutoCon 0. I think it's pretty clear to all of us that automation is a key component of NetOps, right? You're not doing better in NetOps without automation today. But Willis's keynote basically emphasized thinking holistically and thinking outside of the box, and not just out of automation, but even in other fields that you can draw from to help improve whatever vertical or whatever field you're in. Other things in the ops stack that are really important, trouble ticketing, your collaboration tools, what you're doing with security, and how much of that security-related information overlaps with network diagnostic information. There's so much more to what happens in your NetOps operation, so to speak. And Mircea couldn't have teed this up better. I forget exactly how he said it, but we go straight to the tools and the tech. There you are, I see you. We don't spend enough time on people and process. So that's got to be a part of the equation when we talk about total network operations. In my own thinking, this started out as a framework. I thought, hey, maybe we could just, have a better one sheet of paper to tell us how to do it all better. Can't be one person's idea. And it turned into, well, let's see what people are doing and shine a light on it. And that's how the podcast came to be. And now through the podcast, collecting info from many different conversations, one of them you'll hear during the lightning talks. Joseph was a willing victim at NANOG a few weeks ago. Just great conversations with people about the good things that they are doing. That seems to be a much better way to figure out, okay, give you ideas on how you can move your NetOps operation forward. My less than glorious graphics. This is kind of my snapshot on what's involved in the TNOps stack. You don't have to mess with a confidence monitor. Thank you very much. That's fine. Automation and orchestration is definitely a key part. But you've also got to think about interactions with telemetry and visibility. You've got to think about multi-cloud networking these days. Security is obviously important. How AI tooling is coming in there. And that all operates on that base layer infrastructure, which is only increasingly complex today. We've got the standard vendor names that you all know and love or love to hate. And now you've got more options with white box hardware, open source network operating systems, plus all the cloud adjacencies that we have. All this has to serve a higher purpose. And basically, it's to make sure that applications are working that deliver services to end users. All of this needs to be connected. It's appropriate to focus on certain silos, depending on your subject matter expertise and getting certain things done. But there have to be people that can see this all together and how it works all together. So why focus on NetOps now? Well, there's no time like the present, and it's been time for a while, in my opinion. The maturing of networking, and yes, the commoditization of networking, I think gives us a real entree into saying, okay, well, let's put some attention on this to make it better. Right? Things are stabilizing in a sense from an architectural perspective. I think data center architecture is a good example of that. Despite what you may have heard at the debate last night, which was a lot of fun, by the way. Thank you, USNUA, for that. That's not strictly true for networking for AI. There's some really interesting new things happening there, but that's kind of a really closed case. I'm conveniently not really talk about that today. Even if you don't think that architectures are stabilizing, I think I can probably get you to agree over coffee on break that there's opportunity to make NetOps better. I won't make you go through this eye test, but Mike Bouchon, who many of you know, wrote a really good piece on this that happens to agree with me, so I must be right on this. Talking about how standardization of architectures and commoditization of equipment kind of leads to this opportunity for continuing to improve on NetOps. So, how do we organize our ops activities and framework to manage disruption? Have you experienced disruption in the last year, 2 years, 3 years from a tech perspective? Yeah, the whole AI thing is introducing a really interesting bomb into things, but it's nothing new. Like, we signed up for this life, right? Haven't we always been wanting to learn new stuff about networking, about protocols, about what's happening? You wanted this, you asked for this, and it's not gonna stop, and that's okay. We should expect it in NetOps just like we've seen it everywhere else. New tools and tech keep coming to market, keep coming from open source communities, and new processes and new views of things need to be adopted as a result. Who's heard this phrase, software eats the world? It's kind of a big theme for us. We all like to joke and snicker about software-defined networking. And I don't have a firm etymology for the phrase out there, but I'm pretty sure this, the Marc Andreessen quote in about 2012, that software eats the world, is a motivator for why we focused on SDN for as long as we did. I think it's a main driver behind disruption that hitting NetOps. The big idea here is software is fungible, right? I can rewrite, rerun, right? And I can do something different. I can generate functionality and value with software a lot more quickly than I can with hardware, right? And I think that's an objective reality. Hardware still matters. I'll get to that in a second. But it helps me innovate rapidly. That's a dominant idea that's hitting networking, and you need to deal with it, right? We need to get more and more literate with it. The caveats here are, beware of buzz phrase affinity, right? There's no, it's all software now, right? And hardware doesn't matter at all. That is not what I'm saying, right? Hardware still matters. All software runs on hardware, yeah. Come on, you've had enough coffee. You can talk louder than that. Thank you, NVIDIA, for maybe bringing a little more attention to that these days, right? Hardware still matters. But we're not the only tech vertical to have experienced disruption, right? And just look at the history of computing. I know this is an incomplete timeline. I have my selective memory, and just want to point out, look at how we've moved from punch cards. Who actually did stuff on punch cards? I just missed it. But those lowest level programming languages into COBOL and Fortran. I was a Fortran programmer. I made sure I got C as an independent study course in my undergrad. But that's evolved as well, right? With Rust, Go, and we had mentioned of functional programming from Rajiv yesterday. There's so much more in that space now. We saw the platforms evolve, from the mainframe, mini computers, microcomputers, PCs, now smartphones. I should probably include in that list. Networking was a disruptor to computing, right? Trying to figure out how to, connect these machines together via really skinny serial lines way back when, certainly led to more capability there in computing. Chip architectures, complex instruction set to reduced instruction set. Cloud computing, providing boatloads of compute capacity, if you're willing to pay a price. The CPU to GPU migration. There's been all sorts of disruption here that we typically call progress. But if we saw it here, you should expect to see disruption in networking too. Okay. Let me throw out some working definitions for NetOps, DevOps, and NetDevOps. I'm not going to be super precise, but I just like having something to kind of show you where I'm centered. When I say NetOps, I mean traditional network operations. And you'll hear me say trad NetOps, because I want to hear that on other podcasts and other people saying it. Just kidding. DevOps, comes from the world of software delivery. It doesn't map directly to NetOps in all ways. It's a movement, right? And kind of like NAF is a movement. I don't put them in equal footing, right? But it's kind of a grassroots, here's how we can do some things better in software delivery and systems management. Even though my thesis is it doesn't apply directly to NetOps, it's got important principles, and this is a very partial list of them. The main idea of reducing the distance between developers and operators is key. Have that operational mindset in place when you're actually writing the code. That seems to make a lot of sense, right? The idea of radical collaboration and the emergence of tools to facilitate groups of people working on a set of code, checking code in, being able to examine it, check it, do things like that. That all comes from this movement. And the idea of using the best tooling and the best practices and drive improvement of those tools and practices. So those are ideas that we can definitely use in NetOps. So when I say NetDevOps, I loosely mean a really decent hybrid, right? Adapting DevOps principles to NetOps. Some key things to consider here. If I try to match up exactly how DevOps and NetOps would mesh, we've got to account for the presence of physical equipment and constraints, right, in the networking world. You're not going to virtualize the port that the Ethernet cable or the fiber optic cable plugs into. I'm always going to have pets in networking. Sorry, you can argue with me later, but I'm always going to have at least some pets. I name the routers, the pair of routers at this location, because I know that they're there, and they're not ephemeral. They stay there, and I want to know what they are and what they're doing. There's also room for cattle in networking, right? There's going to be, virtualized routers, virtualized switches that get stood up in a data center or on edge equipment and maybe get turned down when they're not needed. But it's not an either or. I'm going to have pets and cattle in NetDevOps. And we need to think about trad NetOps people that don't have the software skills. Right? We can't just go from 0 to 100 and say, you need to be a Kubernetes expert now to run the network. It might be true in a few years, but not everybody's there. So how do we account for that progression? Well, I like the idea of always going into first principles, right? So what are some of the ideas that went into DevOps that I might be able to reapply to NetOps? There's this guy named W. Edwards Deming. He was a manufacturing guy in the 40s through the 90s. And his thought in manufacturing engineering and process engineering really influenced DevOps. Things like doing small experiments and small changes, getting the results and see what happens. Gathering data and iterating, right? Continuous improvement, get a little better with each iteration. Provide solid feedback loops. This is a control theory thing, right? And somebody in Slack, Eric, I don't know where you are, talked about I like routing protocols as network automation. I'm paraphrasing you. I have feedback loops in routing protocols, and I would love to see some of the same stuff, protocol-like automation primitives coming up as a result of that. Empowering people to make changes and putting responsibility on leaders to actually define what needs to be done, right, in conjunction with people. This is not a complete list. There's a lot of good Deming stuff to go read if you'd like to do that. And again, John Willis actually got me thinking about that. I studied Deming stuff years ago as an undergrad, and it's kind of interesting to see it come back today. So how do I apply this to NetOps? Well, there's a continuum, right? One size doesn't fit all. If I just think about it from an automation perspective, there are shops that want to completely roll your own. And we've seen lots of really good examples of that this week, at AutoCon 1 and at AutoCon 0. Others need shrink wrap tooling. And others need a combination of the two, right? And one isn't right and one isn't wrong. It's a matter of fit for purpose, and part of that needs to be how well is your team adapting and what kind of skills does your team have to do this stuff. So I kind of see this continuum for NetOps being trad NetOps on one end and full NetDevOps on the other. What you need to do is figure out where your organization is and figure out, okay, what are my next steps? How do I grow incrementally along that continuum? So how do we manage and leverage this disruption? There's at least two areas to think about here. The disruption to us as individuals, which we talk about a lot, right? Again, that idea of we need to scale up, we need to adapt as individuals, but we also need to talk about how organizations need to do that too. Let's start with focusing on the next gen network engineer, right? It's not just subnet masking and spanning tree and those things anymore. We need to know a lot more, right? The whole idea of the software world becoming more prevalent, more dominant is basically a bogey for us. Increasing literacy in software development, processes and models is good for us, right? It'll help us take from what's happening in the software world and apply it to network operations, okay? It's where the puck is going. That's for William Collins, because he's had many hockey injuries, and I want to get the hockey reference in there. Again, the trick is to figure out where you are and how far you need to go. Okay? So I have this work in process, 100 level, 200 level, 300 level model for what I think the next gen network engineer needs to know. This is arguable. This is totally digital PowerPoint slides. None of this is written in stone. But I feel like this is a decent initial tiering of what do I need to know as a network engineer today? Not next year, but like what do I need to know right now? So I got to start with basic network engineering skills, and some of your basic vendor certs are good for that, right? And I'm citing different vendors here because I'm familiar with them and I can speak to what they do. But there's other skills you need to layer on and layer in. You need to know some Linux. It's not that hard. You need to know some GitHub or other source code control system. I would argue that GitHub is obviously the most common one being used today, but you need to know the principles of checking in code, what is a branch, what is a pull request, etc. You need to know some Python scripting. Okay, if you want to use Bash, I'm not going to argue with you, Chris. I know you'll never give it up. That's not true. I know you've gone beyond that. But you need to have some scripting skills. And then you probably need to have some basic literacy in at least one cloud platform, right? AWS is the most dominant one today. It doesn't have to be AWS, right? But I also need to layer in AI tooling for how do I learn about these things and how they're actually impacting network operations. Like that's 100 level stuff today. I'm not calling that an advanced topic, right? So that's like first cut. There's also obviously vendor-specific things you're going to need in a certain job. Depends on who you're using in your network. You have to adjust and incorporate for that as well. The CLI is not dead. Sorry, Jeremy. Next level, again, you could argue maybe some of this needs to be 100 level, but I need to understand source of truth concepts. And when I say caveated with current vernacular here, whatever we decide to call source of truth, I know there's some people that don't like the use of the word truth here. The basic concept is what should the network look like? What is the config information I should be using? I need to know some infrastructure as code concepts. I really need to understand APIs. And there's so many people, and you know them, who like to sprinkle the term API in a conversation and they have no idea what they actually mean. I think there's room for all of us to get better educated here, knowing some Ansible, knowing some pipeline constructs, and understanding the idea of workflows. Right? Those are all next level stuff. And then beyond that, multi-cloud networking is going to become more important in my view. Observability and telemetry are really important for that closed loop control. Adjacencies with security, that's a no-brainer from my perspective. That's probably something I'm really going to be focusing on in the near term. And other adjacencies in that tech stack, like operations for optical and more. Kubernetes, yeah, because of its dominance and how more software is being delivered through Kubernetes, you probably need to dig in here too, even if you don't end up using it in your environment. So happy to take comments later on what you think should be 100, 200, 300, but I think refining what this model looks like can help us figure out, okay, here's where I am, and what skills can I start adding in, okay? This is all, cooking. You've got to tailor and adjust all this to your environment, the vendors that you're using, the open source that you're using, what your priorities are. You need to set some personal priorities. I think Duan mentioned this yesterday. You got to make yourself uncomfortable, right? You've got to be able to stretch yourself because nobody's going to make you do this. Well, maybe in some situations, but it's better if it comes from you. If we talk about this next year, this is going to change, right? There's going to be new things that slip into the stack, right? You have to realize that things are going to keep changing and there's going to be continued innovation. One of my last minute ideas as I was polishing this last night is I wonder what the OSI model for the next generation network engineer looks like. And I don't know. And I don't want to make an equivalent of the OSI model. And you can say what you want about the lack of application of the OSI model, but it's an interesting construct for like putting lots of ideas together. I think there would be a nice unifying framework for this too for next gen NetOps. Also slipping in from stuff we heard yesterday, there's got to be proactive and intentional mentoring of folks coming into the workforce brand new, and people changing careers, right? Be intentional about it. Help people find their way along this path. All the individual stuff is important, but it's not just you. There's an org aspect to all this that also doesn't get a lot of attention. As we all know that we've had to skill up and learn new things over the course of our careers, organizations do as well. I mean, why would you want to modernize your network infrastructure and not modernize how you operate it? That's a rhetorical question. And I know there's at least one vendor out there that has a really good model for this. I don't want to out them because I want them to be ready to talk about it publicly. One size doesn't fit all. Small, medium organizations and enterprises aren't going to be the same as the hyperscalers ever. But we can adapt and improve NetOps at all levels and all org sizes here. So you got to start somewhere. What are you willing to do in terms of assessing where your organization is? And you can start asking some basic questions. Like, are you willing to budget time to support your team to skill up? Do you budget time and resources for team members to develop skills? Are you willing to look at and re-engineer your workflows and your processes to fit new tooling? And it's an eye chart. I won't make you read it all. You'll see the slides later. But this is kind of the beginnings of an assessment tool. I would love to turn this into a survey to say, all right, you think you want to make NetOps better? All right, where are you? And how do you set a baseline for how you improve? I don't have this all covered. There are gaps to address and things that I'm thinking through. One of the big issues that we talk about with automation, and I think also applies to the broader operations discussion, is demonstrating business value of NetDevOps. So there's this assumption that in the software world that DevOps just makes things better. And I'm not denying that, but can we quantify it? Can we show, hey, if we do these process things, if we invest in people, there's going to be some kind of measurable return. I don't think there's good data out there on that. I'm not saying it isn't there. I haven't found it yet. And I think there's room for people like us to try and pull it together. I think there's a need to protect NetOps interests. I said earlier in the talk, help NetOps participate in its own rescue. You've got to figure out what tools you need to operate the network. Not what's coming down from network architecture folks or even the engineers. Right? What are the tools you need to actually run the network like a fine-tuned machine? We do have to address skills and personnel gaps. We need to build ways to get more people into the workforce from non-traditional roles and sources, not just college graduates. Certainly developing people out of the military, transitioning to commercial is one great source. I think we need to think very broadly here. People who want to make career changes, people who come from very different perspectives. I also think that equation needs to include efficiencies that can and are being brought by AI tooling. And I say that really carefully because there's a strong implication there that one person might be able to do more, which means less people may be needed. And I think that's a real thing. I don't want to deny it, but let's think about it and look at it purposefully. And maybe even work with organizations to come up with transition plans that might be affected. Okay? We're on the lookout for other ideas to look at here. This is just a scratch on the surface list. All right, so what's next? What are you going to see from TNOps? Okay? This is about effort beyond personal skills and us as individuals trying to learn the new tools of the trade that we need. I mean, we're here at AutoCon 2. We're focused on what we can do in the automation realm. That is not just good, not just necessary, not just awesome. It is all of those things, but it's not sufficient. It can't be just a grassroots effort. There needs to be more. And I think that more is engagement with organizations and decision leaders to help them turn the NetOps ship. This is a challenge. This has to complement and support the grassroots efforts that that are really good and happening in places like this. And this is really what I want to do with total network operations. So what's next? I'm going to keep talking to and learning from operators. If you're an operator, and that can be an enterprise network operator or a carrier network operator, talk to me. I'd love to have you on the podcast. I want to keep talking to vendors and help stress the importance of an ops focus for everything you do. I think there's a huge gap in getting operations-centric requirements into vendor products. We've all seen it happen. I've seen it happen on both sides of the aisle, as a vendor and as a network provider. I want to create and curate useful material and resources. I want to keep looking at those adjacencies with other things in the ops stack. And I want to start engaging with companies that do NetOps, that want to do NetOps better. I think that's going to take some outbound effort and maybe some evangelization in 2025 to identify some early companies that really want to have good conversations about that. But I'm open to anybody you might send my way on this. So happy to hear recommendations of people that it'd be good to talk to on this. Listen to the podcast, give me feedback. I know none of you are shy about giving feedback. So please do that. Just to sum it up, automation is key to operations, but operations is much more than automation. Disruption is here to stay, personally and organizationally. We can make NetOps better, personally and organizationally, and I want this TNOps effort to help. What questions do you have?
Got one here in the back.
Hey, that was fantastic. You touched on this a little bit, but how do you view this as? I see a risk, right? I think there's a risk that as we sort of make it so easy for fewer people to do more work, especially the lower level, the easier stuff, that you're strangling your pipeline of the new guys that are going to become the old guys. How do we avoid doing that, right? How do we enable senior engineers and very experienced people to get a ton of stuff done without losing the ability for people to ever get off the ground and start on that path? Or do you see that as a risk at all? So
it's a great question, and it is a risk. I mean, I'll give you an overly simplistic answer. The printing press enabled people to not memorize as much. And there's been this conversation here about how our tools and how our language actually shapes how we think about problems. It's true here too. So I don't want this to sound like a cop-out, but it is a real impact, and I think it's just a change to the landscape. And I'm sorry, I've got to do it. If I'm Tony Stark and now I have an Iron Man suit, I have to learn how to do things a little differently because I have more power, right? I think teasing that out and figuring out what that looks like on a day-to-day basis is part of the challenge. Is that fair? Yeah.
Okay, let's see if I can actually word this. So
eat the mic. Eat the mic.
How about now? Are we good?
The echo is really bad too, but I will try my best.
Okay. What was I going to ask you? Oh, shoot. Hold on. Let me just a second. Oh, so I know, I saw you. So one of the things you talked about earlier in your slideshow as far as, places we could get started, upskilling our employees, and we talked about 100, 200, 300 level, which were all great. I noticed that there's still a lot of companies and groups where, they may even be at AutoCon. They know they need automation, but they don't actually understand why yet. They're not quite there. And so that tells me that maybe there's this step that actually could come before you start upskilling someone, because you can't upskill without reason, right? There has to be some pressures because it costs money, it costs time, et cetera. Do you have any advice in regards to this for organizations that don't have any concrete initiatives they want to look at yet?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I mean, those are some initial engagements I'd love to have. Like, so much of where we are in network operations has just kind of happened, right? If you think about that tremendous growth of the commercial internet from the 90s into the aughts, and then things settling down and slowing down a little bit, I think we have a lot of embedded practices that don't have like an explicit objective to tie to. I think some customer service organizations are probably the best at this. They have SLAs they need to meet. But it's a great engagement question. You know, have you thought about what are the objectives for your organization? Do you have an uptime objective? Do you have a financial objective or a combination of the two? That's great. I know there's more to talk about. All right, Dinesh, I'm going to give you the last question. We don't want to keep people from break. Give them a mic. Yeah, hang on, wait for the mic.
I'm getting a lot of people saying I'm not asking any questions. Two things. First of all, thank you for doing this, Scott, along with, again, the NAF. I think from hearing a lot of people coming to me and talking to me, I see two things. That I missed a part of your talk, and if you cover it, that's great. If not, and I apologize for repeating that part. But the two things I see missing that I hear a lot of people are, I see people stand up there and tell me they come from these fairly large companies. They tell me they did these amazing things over this time, and now they are over here. That's like me going to a tennis academy, tennis conference, and having Roger Federer there tell me all the stuff he does, and I still don't know which end of the racket to hold up. So I think trying to get a few more of the talks, the talk of the challenge without the success, would make the community feel that they are not alone in what they are doing.
Sure.
I think a lot of people might feel, am I alone listening to all these talks of all these bright people, and am I the only one struggling? I think trying to emphasize that as a community, that we are all trying to do this in a different way and not just talk of the huge successes, is important.
Let me respond to that very quickly.
Okay.
So get out of my head. With help from our great friends at Nanog, I actually went to Toronto Nanog a month or so ago to just talk to operators. And the things that emerged from 7 or 8 of those conversations were significant common themes, right? So they're not alone, and I think as those episodes come out in January and February, that's going to be a theme to build on for sure.
I'm also saying let's have those talks in NAF.
Say that again.
Okay, let's have those talks with those struggles, not just in the TNOps podcast, but also in the NAF conference schedule.
Also, an interesting concept. Here's the thing. We really like the focus that NAF has, and we don't want to dilute it. So we have to think about that very carefully. We hear you, right? And Chris and I are always talking about what the next things look like. So message received, we'll take it under consideration.
Okay, the second thing I wanted to say was, I think, again, people over here struggle with one other thing, which is, and I was talking to somebody right now, and he wants to talk to you guys about it, so that's great. But I think what a lot of people struggle here with also is, how do they convey this business, what they do, into whatever is the upper business part, and having a few more talks that are more specific. You see, the trouble I find many times is they are a little high level, and for my specificity, having specific examples more precisely is very helpful. And maybe just like we started the framework talk, it might be useful to start a how do we bridge this conversation gap talk.
Yeah.
So that's the second thing.
No, also, so that's great confirmation, because I'm trying to actually generate content on that, and just to really embarrass him. My partner in crime on this is James Dirksen. Is he still in the room? James is the best constructive critic that I've ever had for any of these ideas, and he's really helping us write and pull some of those ideas together. So, tell you what, let's let people go to break. If you want to talk more, hit me up. I'm happy. I'm 9 minutes over. You know I'm happy to keep talking. So thank you very much.